Reviewing the 2015 general election campaign. My name's David James. I'm a news editor at WalesOnline, and we've put together some of Wales' leading political experts and our own politics team to try and make sense of the last month and indeed the last couple of years of this election campaign. We're going to be looking at the winners, the losers, the key moments, and we'd like everyone to join in. So if you want to tell us your thoughts or submit a question, you can do it on Google Plus itself or by tweeting WalesOnline using the hashtag GE2015. So I'll just introduce you to our panel today. We have with us from the Caribbean Daran Hill, founder of the political consultancy Positif Politics. We have in Cardiff Bay Roger Scully, Professor of Political Science from the Wales Governance Centre. And we have our own political experts who, if you're regulars on WalesOnline, hopefully you'll know by now. We have Chief Reporter Martin Shipton. We have in Westminster Williamson. And in Cardiff Bay, we have our Senate correspondent, David Deeds.
Hello.
So we thought we'd start by asking our experts who they thought, which party they thought had the best campaign and the worst campaign. So let's start with you, Daran.
I think the best campaign actually has been Plaid Cymru's campaign. I say that because it's been run far more professionally than anything I've ever seen them do at a Westminster level before. And I think the worst campaign, actually, I'm quite surprised by, but to my mind, it's been the Conservative campaign. Just because I think it's failed to inspire and hasn't really had a message over and above keep pressing on with what we're doing, keep the economy on solid ground.
Yeah, interesting. David Deans?
I think the SNP by far have had a fantastic campaign so far. The mere fact that you've got people in England telling pollsters that they quite like to vote for Nicola Sturgeon despite them being completely incapable of doing so shows how the appeal of their leader. And I think the worst campaign, I think the Greens have been pretty disappointing, really. There's been all this talk about a Green surge, but they've completely failed to take advantage of the platform they've been offered. And I think it's shown a lot of the organisational problems they have. Seem to be too tied to these idealistic sort of notions that everyone's autonomous. They end up with a leader like Natalie Bennett who doesn't know the policies when she's pressed on them. And I think they really need to take a long, hard look at themselves if they're going to operate within this new context of multi-party politics. They need to have an effective machine. At the moment, they've shown that they haven't got one at all.
Okay. Thanks, David. Mr. Williamson, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I think at a UK level, I think there's a strong argument that Labour have actually had a very successful campaign, in the sense that for half a decade we've had Ed Miliband really struggling to have a public persona that reaches the public, and yet he's come through these various debates and question time sessions as a more pugnacious and self-confident person. That's finally come across. If you actually look at the manifesto and sort of write out the things that he said with great passion, a lot of the time he is very much under-promising. They're aware that there isn't much money to play around. Yet, in terms of moving the party on from where they were in 2010, the ghosts of Iraq, PFI, tuition fees, all those types of things have been to a great sense exercised. And you get the sense when you go to a Labour Party conference now that the people who are there, you see a lot of young people, and they do actually feel a sense of ownership of this. Now, if someone had said, when we're looking at one of the worst results in Labour's history in 2010, that in 5 years' time you're going to be in this position, I think they would be quite happy with that. I mean, the flip side of it is that the worst campaign has been pro-Scottish Labour as well. So it's, yeah.
Okay, Martin?
I think it is the SNP. What they've managed to do by gaining such a huge level of support in Scotland is to bamboozle the major parties in England into a position where their influence is going to be brought to play after the election results. And the fact that in the last few days there has been this hysteria created by the Conservatives and fed into by the Labour Party about the dangers of having the SNP with any kind of role in the future government of the UK indicates the fear that has been created by the campaign which they have run. And I mean, I do think as well that given that the referendum result last September eventually turned out to be a 10% victory for the No campaign, it's been quite remarkable how the SNP has, in a sense, reinvented itself and has been able to demonstrate its ability to garner a huge amount of support in Scotland, and also through the debates in which Nicola Sturgeon has been introduced to a wider UK audience to actually get some traction that way. In terms of the worst campaign, I think I would also say the Conservatives, because clearly Linton Crosby, their Australian advisor, had been giving them the impression that by Christmas time they were going to be breaking away from Labour and making the running. They initially were concentrating all their efforts into trying to expose Ed Miliband as a very weak leader in comparison with the statesman Cameron, and I think that the contrast that they were trying to project is inherently absurd, because Ed Miliband, as was demonstrated during the debates, is actually somebody to be contended with. He is not a fool. Cameron is not a towering colossus as a statesman, and therefore that failed. I think they also failed with their promised giveaways. You know, they were coming out a couple of weeks ago with some announcements about goodies that you would get if you voted Conservative. Because they were completely uncosted, I think that they weren't taken seriously. And then latterly, they've had perhaps not as much traction as they would have expected to get from this demonisation of the SNP. I'm sure it's had a certain degree of influence in England, but the polls would suggest that it hasn't had that decisive impact to put them way ahead in the field.
Okay, and Professor Scully.
Roger, please. I think I would agree with Martin in terms of the best campaign. I think of all of them has been the SNP, and the worst, and on occasion I think even probably the most unpleasant, has been Scottish Labour. Looking GB-wide, I would say I think the best campaign has been the Liberal Democrats. I think despite an awful lot of scepticism and problems, I think they've displayed a certain resilience, Nick Clegg individually a certain resilience, as well as frankly keeping their sense of humour, which would kind of been easy in difficult times. The worst GB-wide campaign I think has been UKIP. And I think to some extent they've been shown up for their lack of professionalism. When you get into a full-scale election campaign, you can't just depend on Nigel Farage being an eloquent, cheeky chappie on the Andrew Marr sofa.
It's interesting you say that. I'm very glad you mentioned both UKIP and the Liberal Democrats. You're the first person to do so. But if you actually look at the poll of polls, they're the only two parties who've seen serious movement in their level of support. UKIP's obviously fallen, I think, throughout the campaign, and the Lib Dems have risen.
Well, yeah. I mean, even there's not big movements, but the general trend with UKIP has been for the last few months for them to be tending to be edging downwards. And Liberal Democrats, most of the polls at the moment seem to be having them just edging up a little bit. And with the last Welsh poll that's being published later today, it'll be interesting to see if we see anything along those lines as well.
I mean, what would you put that down to? Would you put that down to the relative success on TV, or do you think it's something else that's happening there?
Well, I think although he does face a lot of scepticism these days, Nick Clegg is still a very effective performer, and I thought he was clearly the best of the three UK leaders in the Question Time sessions last week. I think it's also the fact when it's come nearer to the election, you have to think about what are the plausible governments. And maybe some sort of moderating influence of the Liberal Democrats does start to look a little bit more attractive. And we've seen a number of newspapers, perhaps unexpectedly, coming out with suggestions that where they can win, there should be a tactical vote for the Liberal Democrats, that sort of thing. I still think they're going to have a difficult time tomorrow night. Their vote share is going to go down, I would think, by at least half from the last election. They're going to lose quite a few seats, but nonetheless, I think they've shown a certain degree of resilience in very difficult times, which has been to at least some degree impressive.
Okay. Well, by hook or by crook, going through that, we've sort of looked at in a very brief way, most of the parties, I think. We'll obviously come back to them. One of the things we wanted to look at was what has made this election campaign different to previous election campaigns we've seen. Obviously, I'm happy. I would like any of you to raise anything as we go around that I don't pick up. But there's certain sort of issues I sort of wanted to get your thoughts on, if that's all right. One was the BBC did a very good piece on it on the 10 o'clock news last night. It was the extent to which the parties have stage managed their campaigns. They've kept the public away from the leaders. You haven't had situations where, you know, I used to, as a younger reporter, chasing a politician down, David Cameron, in fact, down Queen Street, trying to catch members of the public who just shouted at him. Now, David Deans, I know you actually tackled Ed Miliband on this when you met him in Rubina. What did he say to you?
Well, he rubbished the question by, well, I basically asked him, we're talking about Russell Brand, and I was trying to see if he would talk about endorsements, and he didn't, and lo and behold, Brand later endorsed him. But I said, well, isn't really the problem with engagement in this campaign is that all the parties are fighting a sanitised campaign? And he rubbished that and said, well, I've just gone and spoken to Russell Brand, which I don't think answers the question. Sure, it puts you in a situation where you look a bit silly, but the reality is that neither of the major party leaders are putting themselves in harm's way and talk to normal folk. Today was a case in point. I was up in Crickhowell to meet David Cameron. Now it was it was a relatively controlled environment. We were in a press huddle with some other local hacks from papers in Mid Wales. I just wanted a picture of me sat with the other two hacks of me having a chat with Cameron. No, can't do that. It's so controlled that I can't even take a quick selfie. But it was absolutely, it didn't make any sense because ITV and the Beeb were filming the thing.
Bring Daran
and I suppose I could have just been completely rude and taken a photo, but it was ridiculous.
Do you think this matters? Do you think it makes a difference? Do you think one of Labour or the Conservatives could have gained traction, could have won more support if they had been more open to interaction with the public?
It strikes me that I'm reminded, certainly with the campaign that the Conservatives have run this time, of the campaign that Labour ran in 2001, where they really didn't want to rock the boat at all. They essentially wanted to get re-elected into government on an economic record, and they had very little else to say at that particular time. So all the focus was on the leader and stability and not rocking the boat. Conversely, although Labour's also run a sanitised campaign, I at least think they've had things to say and they've taken a few chances. I think what's made it very dull from the Conservative sanitised version is they've taken no chances, no gambles at all. In fact, when I look back over the last 7 weeks, the most memorable bit from the Conservative campaign to me was when the Defence Secretary talked about Ed Miliband stabbing his brother in the back and therefore stabbing the UK in the back, which, frankly at the time I thought was a bit of a throwaway. But it seems to have been the only throwaway that happened over the last 6-7 weeks with the Conservatives.
Okay, I mean, David Williamson, do you think the Tories have been overconfident? Do you think they could do what Labour did in 2001 and just coast to a win?
Yeah, I think it's that actually they've been trying to do two mutually exclusive things. On one level, they're trying to keep people nervous, to say that the job isn't finished and that they need to carry on, that the red warning lights are flashing. Now that makes people feel, oh help, the economy isn't in a golden age. And then at the other time saying, you're better off, we're doing better than anyone else in the industrialized world. And it's quite an oxymoron. These two things are coming, and people I think are left a little bit confused. And normally, the opportunities for narrative to be thrashed out in a campaign come through things like press conferences where people are jousting, or they come through, even actually getting out onto the streets, the John Major moments. But there hasn't been the soapbox. There's been the image of being out on the streets, but there hasn't been. And I think actually they're going to draw the lesson that when you sanitize things, you lose a lot of your own energy, and that stops you from communicating with people. So yeah, in that sense, it's been a great case study of how to lose a huge amount of potential momentum by trying to run things both ways.
What about you, Martin? Do you think either
Well,
of
what I was going to say was that I think there's been far too much cooking. I remember going to see David Cameron when he was making a visit to Brains Brewery in Cardiff, and the journalists who were there were very much shepherded around by the party officials, and I went with a couple of young women into some room which normally serves as the host bar by Brains to dish out beer to people who are visiting. Sadly, that wasn't the case on this occasion. We kept hanging around for quite a while, as I subsequently discovered, David Cameron and his wife were making a Brains steak and kidney pie, or making the best fist of it. And this was obviously for some photo opportunity, for something to go on the television. And it's this sort of nonsense which I think this time around has been seen as a substitute for proper debate and for proper engagement with the public. And instead of seeing David Cameron's ham-fisted attempt to make a steak and kidney pie, I'd be far more interested hearing him explain why he thinks doubling the cuts is a great idea.
Mm-hmm. In fact, it's an interesting point, isn't it? The parties have very much used traditional media photo opportunities. There's been very little attempt to sort of engage the public either in person or through social media directly. It's just the major broadcasters have been left to sort of distribute their content as they would always have done. I guess if we're looking at differences with previous elections, one of the key ones obviously has to be the way that the debates or lack of them were conducted this time. Roger, have you noticed an impact of the way they've been done this time on the polls, on how the parties have been perceived?
Well, I mean, the polls generally have changed very little. I mean, there's been a little bit of turbulence up and down, but the broad trends, I mean, essentially they are now today where they were a week ago, or a month ago, or 3 months ago. Very little has actually happened in terms of the polls, which I think is interesting if you reflect on. Daran was talking about a few minutes ago about 2001, where Labour ran this incredibly safe, sanitised campaign, but Labour then were 15 to 20 points ahead in the polls. I think you can afford to run a very safe, sanitised campaign when you're in a big, clear lead. When you don't have that position, then I think it becomes much less sensible to run this really incredibly dull campaign. I think these sort of safe, contrived events also really do predate social media, in that it's very easy now to get out these photos which show how essentially fraudulent and faked a lot of these events are. And so you've had various things like the Cameron apparently crowded rally in that actually 4/5 empty barn. It's very easy for these things to actually then be disseminated. And so we had Jim Murphy with Scotland, and apparently surrounded by supporters at a rally which in fact took place at 7 o'clock in the morning, with about 15 people there. It's very easy for these things to be debunked now. And I think the parties need to move on and realise that. And I think one thing which has to some extent marked out the campaigns, both of the SNP and of Plaid Cymru, is that they have had their leaders actually going out and meeting people on the street. Now we'll find out whether that actually translates into votes, but it has certainly, I think, given the campaign a certain sense of authenticity, which particularly the Conservative campaign, but also to some extent the Labour and Lib Dem ones have struggled for. I think one of the images that might well be remembered most from this campaign, other than the Ed Stone, is that one of David Cameron on a train platform with a bunch of his advisors, providing a human shield around him, to stop, God forbid, any ordinary voters coming into contact with the leader in an ordinary conversation. Look, I realise there are security concerns and whatever, but at times this has been so over the top.
Indeed.
Sorry, David, you want to come in here?
No, it's just because sometimes election campaigns are remembered for that contact with the voter. The 83 campaign with the phone caller who wanted to challenge Mrs. Thatcher on the Belgrano, the way John Major conducted himself in 92, the way John Prescott conducted himself in 2001, and the way Gordon Brown conducted himself with the woman in Rochdale back in 2010. So by keeping the public excluded, it's been less interesting. Though there has been one big forum where they haven't been excluded, and that's the debates, coming back to the point of David's original question. And some of those debates have actually been fiery and lively. I think when we look back at this election, certainly my memory of those debates is that they weren't the big debate I wanted to see, which was between the two potential prime ministers of this country head to head. I think the absence of that particular debate is noticeable, and instead we've had a series of debates, some of which have been more interesting than others. I mean, frankly, I think the low point of the campaign, and in saying this, I'm sure I'm going to offend a number of people listening in today, was the one between the opposition leaders on a UK level, where the five of them came together, and four of them, that's 80% of the panel, commanded just 12 seats out of 650 in the House of Commons. And I thought that entire debate was pretty irrelevant and rather curious, when actually we weren't getting a debate between potential prime ministers of this country, which is what should have happened.
So, David Williamson, if David Cameron ends up packing his bags on Friday and moving out of number 10, do you think he will he'll regret not allowing?
Yeah, I think there was a huge missed opportunity in the sense that David Cameron actually does these regular Cameron Direct events around the country, and certainly in the early days of his premiership did, and he actually responds quite well to hecklers. He does, I think it's what a lot of his opponents would actually agree, he does possess this ability to charm individuals face to face, and it would have been good to see him actually out there defending his policies. What makes it all the more maddening is that this has been actually an election when there have been genuinely huge questions to be answered. And we've seen the Institute for Fiscal Studies almost coming into its own as this neutral arbiter of going through manifesto promises. And these statisticians have been tearing their hair out, saying, we simply cannot say what's going to happen to tax, to benefits, to borrowing from across the parties. But one of the issues that has come to the fore is the Conservatives' welfare cuts. Where is this £12 billion going to come from? And so this has been a question that's being asked for the past month, and yet there hasn't been a concluding answer that actually answers that. And this sense of an evasive political establishment, not just limited to the Conservatives, because the Lib Dems and Labour have also come under fire, is, I think, one of the things that people are going to take away. Here we are, just a few years on from the expenses scandal, and all this great distrust of the political elite, and yet the sense of an elite that doesn't actually deign to answer basic questions is still here, and this means that the conditions in which the anti-politics moves has developed in this country is, if anything, is probably going to come out of this election stronger than ever.
Yeah, I agree with almost everything David said there. I think that's some very astute comments.
Thanks, Roger.
First time for everything, David?
Do you think it'll have an impact on turnout? Well, Roger, if you could take David's point that there's a sort of the way the campaigns have been conducted has intensified the sense of mistrust, will it have an impact on turnout?
Well, it certainly won't help. I mean, I suspect turnout will be up in Scotland, where there seems to be this enormous political engagement post-referendum. The rest of the UK, the UKIP factor will, to some degree, help turnout, because part of UKIP's support has been coming from people who didn't vote previously. But I think, Daran was talking about the 2001 election earlier and that incredibly sanitized campaign that Labour tried to run. It's possibly no coincidence that was the election where we saw the turnout graph sort of fall off the edge of a cliff. And in general, I think these campaigns, you can to some degree understand why parties run them. They want to avoid the horror shows on TV. They want to avoid the big mistakes. But the long-term impact of them is to alienate them from the electorate, and it does, I think, generally tend to depress turnout and to increase cynicism.
Okay, Martin, what do you think? I mean, 5 years ago, the defining issue of the election campaign was the deficit, was austerity, was the Tories sort of promised to get in order. We haven't really had one this time. And that's David. Oh, do you think we have?
Well, I mean, I think it's a little shocking, if you like, that despite the fact that there is a plan by the Conservatives to double the cuts next year, that hasn't really come across in the campaign, and I think that Labour hasn't really been prepared to have a go at the Conservatives over their plans for cuts in public expenditure, largely because they're desperate to try to shake off this image of being irresponsible, and there's still an enormous number of people who believe that the financial crisis that began in 2008 and obviously went through to the general election in 2010 was the responsibility and the fault of the Labour Party, and they can't really shake that off, and therefore it's rather strange that, looking at the Institute of Fiscal Studies analysis of spending plans, it's possible to make a case to suggest that Labour is actually a closet anti-austerity party, because it does appear from the analysis that I looked at that the cuts that they're proposing are very minimal, and in fact Jim Murphy, of course, got slapped down in Scotland by Ed Balls, and it was made clear that Jim Murphy was not responsible for the Labour Party's future spending plans and budget, but in fact, based on what the IFS has said, Jim Murphy's comments about there being no need for any further cuts do appear to be pretty close to what Labour is actually proposing, but Labour doesn't actually want to say that for fear of the Conservatives coming in and saying you're just irresponsible with your money. And of course Labour has made this big point about saying that all of their promises are fully costed, and any increases in benefits are offset by the mansion tax, etc., etc. But that's what's really surprised me. I would have thought that given what a lot of communities have had to suffer as a result of the cuts that have been imposed, you would really have expected Labour to have made more of that.
I think the problem, though, is sorry. I was going to say, I think the problem, though, is that Labour lost an important part of that argument about 45 years ago. I think they lost the basic argument in terms of austerity and cuts and what is sensible long-term economic planning and possible counter-cyclical spending and so on. And so I think having lost control of the narrative on that, they've had, I think, as I think you more or less rightly say, Martin, to be this sort of closet anti-austerity party, because they just can't go sort of full out in public on that argument, because they'll lose.
But what surprised me is that there are other elements of macroeconomic performance that haven't featured at all. If you think back to the 2010 election and the fuss that the Conservatives made about keeping the AAA rating for the economy on the international stage in terms of borrowing and spending and that was seen as an absolutely central plank. The fact that that rating no longer applies, and the fact that nobody seems to have been bringing this up in this general election at all, to me seems incredibly curious. Okay, well maybe it's just the markets that care about this sort of thing. But the Tories actually made it an election issue last time round.
Obviously, what I'm curious to know is how many people will be thinking about the deficit, thinking about austerity when they go to cast their vote on tomorrow. David Deans, do you get the sense that this is a big issue for people still?
I think the biggest issues for people probably are still health and education, which is probably a damning indictment of the political and media class in Wales, considering I think that we probably still haven't, people still don't separate those issues from a general election campaign. I think people are more concerned about whether their hospitals and schools are better funded than esoteric arguments that they don't understand necessarily about finance. Having said that, I think there is it is really ingrained in the public consciousness that Labour were profligate spenders during their last government, and that will explain, I think, why Labour have not made it clearer that there is a great difference between them and the Conservatives on spending. I think they could have been clearer in stating what the ultimate conclusion of where we're going with some of these Tory spending plans, because I do wonder about the future of the United Kingdom and the state itself, and I think they haven't been very clear in getting that across.
We seem to be saying that the parties have alienated the public by not being more honest about what they're going to do in terms of spending if they win the election. Yeah, we're also saying that Labour couldn't really do anything different because if it had said it was going to spend more, it would lose. What should Labour have done, Roger?
Well, I think they in a sense, as I was saying earlier, they sort of lost the argument on this about 4 or 5 years ago. The last days of the Brown Premiership, the first year or two of this Parliament, when I think that argument was lost in a fairly serious way, and it's become pretty embedded, I think, in the consciousness now. The idea that Labour spent far too much and messed up the management of the economy, and I think they've had to do, in the short term, this election campaign, they've made the best of a bad job. What they needed to do probably was, maybe when new leader was elected after the last general elections, to have a much stronger counter-argument being developed then. That was saying that various people have used in this election that you can't fatten a pig on market day. Similarly, you can't win an argument about economic competence in the last few weeks before an election.
Martin, would you have liked to see them put a picture of Paul Krugman on the front page of the manifesto?
I would. I'm a great fan of Paul Krugman, the great anti-austerity economist, Nobel Prize winner and all that. I think the problem is that all of this diffidence and failure to actually make a case and failure to show leadership over the last few years has actually not served Labour well, because, as Roger says, you can't just in a few weeks of an election campaign suddenly try to change the narrative. I think they should have been arguing the case for what they did far more coherently. Peter Hain recently published a book in which he became the first former Labour cabinet minister to come out with an anti-austerity narrative, and I think that they believe it. Most of them actually believe in that, but they have been told, presumably by their focus groups and by their advisors, that it's not an appropriate thing for them to say. And I think that this lack of candour has actually meant that that Labour, which ought to have been in a far more powerful position at this election because of all the cuts that people have been subjected to, not just in terms of public sector spending cuts, but also in terms of real terms pay cuts, because it's only been in the last year that pay has actually started to overtake inflation again. And a government which has had this record of actually decreasing people's spending power and screwing people who are being forced to, poorest people being forced to pay things like the bedroom tax. They really should not have been in contention at this election, but they have been because I think over the last few years Labour has pulled its punches.
I think Martin's absolutely right. The fact it took Labour 2 to 3 years to commit to actually abolishing the so-called bedroom tax from the point at which it was introduced, I think speaks volumes. It should have been an absolute no-brainer, which they should have never countenanced in any form from day one. But this space that they've left has been very effectively filled, certainly during this campaign, by the SNP and by Plaid Cymru. And I think one of the big outcomes for Welsh politics in this election, regardless of whether Plaid picks up seats or not, is that no one can ever say that Plaid is not clearly a party of the left anymore, because they have seized the anti-austerity agenda. They've virtually made it their own here in Wales, and they've developed a loud and coherent case around it. In many ways, in space where Labour previously has vacated.
I'm glad you brought the conversation back to Plaid, because we've only briefly mentioned Plaid. I mean, it was you, Darren, sort of first off. You picked them as having had the best campaign. I mean, it's undoubtedly been a feel-good election for Plaid. I mean, obviously, tomorrow will determine whether it's remembered like that. But Leanne's performed, I think, very well on the debates.
Yeah.
Where does Plaid go from here?
You know, UK general elections are never easy for Plaid, but actually this one's been a bit easier than others because they've been able to occupy that space because of the strength of the SNP, and frankly because they've run probably the best and most focused, on message, well coordinated campaign I've ever seen them run. That's not to say I necessarily agree with what they've been saying, but I respect the consistency and the simplicity in some ways that they've managed to convey that. They've been helped enormously by the amount of time and space given to Leanne Wood as leader as well. I mean, I think if Plaid spent the last general election campaign not complaining about not being included in the debates, which to me seemed to be their main election message in 2010, well, they've been included, to my mind, perhaps in too many debates this time, and you know they've really just been everywhere. And frankly, I'm a little bit bored of listening to Leanne. I've seen her so often, but there we are. You know, I'm sure Plaid are happy.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting when we get to do our first poll. Well, it's always interesting when we get to do a poll, but it'll be interesting when we get to do the first one once the dust has settled after the election. I hope we'll be able to include a question there on the leaders. I would suspect it'll show that Leanne is now the most high-profile Welsh politician, bar none.
Okay.
Which she certainly was not 3 months ago. She's also, it seems to me, just looking at it from the outside, visibly grown in confidence throughout the course of the campaign. And I thought in the first 7 away leaders debate, she visibly looked nervous at first, although she got into it and had that very good counter to Nigel Farage. By the time of the 2 Welsh debates, I thought she looked the most comfortable and most confident person on the stage. And the sort of reaction that she's been getting in a lot of her public events has been apparently very positive. Now, we don't know yet whether that will translate into any votes in the context of a general election for her party, but I think it does put her in a good position as working ahead 12 months to the Assembly election campaign, which of course starts next Monday.
Well, that brings us nicely on to one of the other topics we wanted to get to, which was the people, the winners and losers, the people who'd sort of enhanced their reputations and those who'd done them no favours at all. So I mean, I think most people would agree Leanne's one of the winners. David Deans, do you want to pick out any other winners or losers?
I think Miliband's done all right. I think he started the campaign being the bacon sandwich man, and I think people look at him now and you can see him being PM. I mean, they might not think will be a particularly polished personality. I don't think he ever will, but I think in terms of improving his image, I think the campaign has served him okay. He's done well.
David Williamson, how do you think David Cameron's done? Has he enhanced his reputation? David, can you hear me?
Oh, sorry, it's a blanked out. I think the Cameron of 2010 now seems a very distant figure. The big society, and do you remember the manifesto that came out with all those incredible sort of graffiti-style pictures? That's very much gone. And you get the sense that while a lot of Conservative aspiring MPs in 2010 didn't really understand the concept of the big society, Cameron actually did believe in something and thought there was something that was there. And then in the Rose Garden, when the coalition was launched, and you had Cameron talking about a liberal Conservative government, again, there was a sense that this was exciting something in his passions. This time round, it has been such a disciplined, sort of Grant Shapps-led, conservative in core vote strategy to such a huge extent that that element of the things that actually bring Cameron a bit of interesting individuality have almost been censored. So in that sense, especially with the IFS hammering him for being vague, he's seeming less sunny, more evasive. It hasn't probably been the most enjoyable campaign for him. He's also been under criticism for not looking enthusiastic. So then we had those press conferences, I think at the start of last week, where he was in front of members of the small business community, where he was positively bopping up and down on springs. And it seemed to be the other extreme again. So it's been a very difficult campaign for him. But I mean, I think also it's the contrast with Nicola, where she seems to be articulating the sense of a legion of armies, an actual force of cultural change as much as political change, and that's something which no other leader who shared that astonishingly large stage in the first debate can really say.
Whereas Martin, I mean, you've sort of spoken of your admiration for Nicola Sturgeon before, so I won't bring you on to that topic. But what do you think of Nigel Farage's campaign? He hasn't really had the impact I think many people thought or feared that he would have done.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, I was going to say that in terms of political leaders who have actually done badly, I think it is Nigel Farage. I remember watching the debate when he was on the far right of the podium, and it was very much a case of the women, Leanne Wood, Nicola Sturgeon, and Natalie Bennett, as it were, taking potshots at him. And he didn't really come out of it very well. I mean, that comment when he started having a go at the audience, saying they were a bunch of lefties, was really shocking for a political leader to make. I mean, he should have swallowed his pride and just said what he wanted to say instead of having a go at the audience. That really is the sign of somebody who is losing out. And while clearly the UKIP's vote is going to be far higher than it was at the last general election, they're not going to be taking off in the way that people had been suggesting that they might do. And I'm going to be very surprised if they end up with more than 3 seats at the very top.
Roger, any particular individual performances you want to pull out?
Well, I think with pretty much everyone, I think Nicola Sturgeon has had a very good election. I think Leanne Wood, as I was saying earlier, has grown and flourished to some extent. And as I said before, I've actually been impressed, given the difficult circumstances, by Nick Clegg. I think the problem for him is not so much his performances as how many people are still willing to listen to him. But I think he's actually, of the 3 UK party leaders, been the most consistently impressive in his public performances. The least impressive leaders around, I think in Wales, I don't think the TV debate format seems to suit Owen Smith's particular skills. And I think Jim Murphy, I mean, the poor guy is visibly aging before our eyes in Scotland. You look at photos of him now compared with 6 months ago, it looks like one of those things where people compare a US president, the start of their presidency, and the end of it 8 years later. And I think he's run a campaign which seemed to have a pretty negative effect on him. It's also had a fairly negative effect on his party. And well, if Lord Ashcroft's polls are going to be believed, then the only thing that's going to put him out of his misery is that he's likely to lose his seat tomorrow night.
And in terms of somebody else who's likely to lose their seat or not is Nick Clegg, and I happen to agree with Roger that he's conducted himself well during this campaign. Actually, it's always difficult to take the person out of politics. I'm not going to do that. I genuinely think it'd be whatever else happens tomorrow night. I think it'd be a real shame if Nick Clegg lost his seat, because I think he's shown himself to be a skilled and warm politician, particularly during this campaign.
Okay, well, we've nearly done 3/4 of an hour, so just to wrap up, it's the Mugs game making predictions, but I'm curious to know what you think is going to happen tomorrow. So if I go through you in the same order we started with, so Daran, what do you think?
I think there's going to be a hung parliament. Bum bum.
Okay. Who do you think is going to have the most seats?
I've got a gut feeling that Labour will have the most seats, but the Conservatives will have a higher national vote share.
Hooray!
David Deeds.
I think in Wales we'll probably see 2 seats chained hands at most. Maybe 1 or 2 surprises here or there. I think tomorrow in Wales it may not be. There might not be a great change, but I tend to agree. I think we could be heading towards having a Miliband as a PM.
David Williamson.
Goodness. I think what will be very interesting is that there's the general expectation that most of the Tory seats, with the exception of Cardiff North, are not under great threat in Wales, which is fascinating when you think of how they were completely wiped out in 1997 and 2001. So although it's not the story that necessarily makes the headlines, if they can cling on to seats that are held by Labour in the Assembly, like the Vale of Glamorgan, if they can stop the Lib Dems returning in Montgomeryshire, if the Pembrokeshire seats become even more rock solid, that actually puts them in quite a good position for 2020, or if we're here in just a few months' time, a second general election.
Martin.
I think it's going to be extremely close in terms of whether the Conservatives or Labour are the leading party. What I think is going to define what happens after the election is whether Ed Miliband sticks to this rather self-defeating view that he's not going to engage with the SNP, because I think that if he followed that through and we were in a position where David Cameron was somehow able to stay in Downing Street because of Miliband's failure to engage with the SNP, I think that long-term damage would be done to the Labour Party.
And Roger.
Well, on that last point by Martin, I mean, I think if the Labour Party were to have an opportunity to govern but were to refuse it and effectively put David Cameron in office, I think that would be pretty close to the end of the Scottish Labour Party. I mean, it would be very difficult to see how politically they could defend that. Indeed, I'm not sure all of their elected, say, members of the Scottish Parliament would want to defend that position. I think it's going to be very close for largest party, both in votes and seats. So if I had to put the mortgage on it, I think the Tories will be just ahead in terms of seats. But in terms of getting to sort of 323, for support for a Queen's speech and to be able to resist no confidence motions, there are simply far more avenues by which Labour can get there than the Conservatives can do so. So at some point in this month, although it may have to wait a while, I suspect that Ed Miliband will be becoming Prime Minister.
But we'll all find out tomorrow, I guess.
Well, we won't. We probably won't. That's the point. It may take a while.
In fact, you'll probably all be back here on a chat very soon discussing what it all means, what's going to happen. So on that note, thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you everyone who's watched. I hope you found it interesting. You can watch it back in full by visiting our website or the Google Plus page. Thank you very much.